How's it going, everybody? This is Blister coming at you with another classic WoW video. In today's video, we're going to be going over PvP ratios and which is best for each class. So before we actually get into the classes and which race is best for them for the Horde and the Alliance, I think we actually need to go through each race and talk about each independent racial and whether or not it's good for PvP situations or not. So to do that, we're going to start off with the Alliance. And first up is the human. The human's first racial is diplomacy. Diplomacy just gives you 10% rep gain, completely useless for PvP. We're moving on. The human spirit. The human spirit increases your spirit by 5%. Now a lot of people may think this is useless, but it will help you with your mana regen, especially if you're a healer because you're already going to have a lot of spirit. So for healers, it's nice. It's not something that I would go out of my way to get though, because in PvP, you're probably not going to have too many situations where you're completely out of mana and you need it. So it's not something you should go out of your way to get. The next two racials are mace specialization and sword specialization. Both of those will increase your skill with mace and swords for one-handed and two-handed by 5. So depending on your build and your class, this actually could be pretty useful. It's not going to be, again, like the human spirit, it's not going to be something that you should go out of your way to get. It will help with your misses, but it's definitely not something that you should be worrying about. And the last racial that we have for the humans is perception. Perception dramatically increases your stealth detection for 20 seconds and has a 3-minute cooldown. Perception is actually a pretty decent racial, I mean, especially when you're going up against rogues and feral druids. So this is the one racial out of everything the humans have that you're actually going to say is a thumbs up for them. But overall, these guys really don't have too many really good racials when it comes to PvP. Next up is the dwarf. The dwarf's first racial is find treasure, which essentially is just going to let you find treasures while they're near you on your minimap. Completely useless, again, just like diplomacy. Next, frost resistance. Frost resistance increases your frost resistance by 10. This is actually kind of useful. It's mainly going to be useful for when you're going up against frost mages, but it's still something that every class can benefit that a dwarf can play. Next up is stone form. Stone form, when you activate it, grants you immunity to bleed, poison, and disease effects. In addition, it also increases your armor by 10%. It lasts for 8 seconds and has a 3-minute cooldown. Now, this is just an extra defensive, and it's a pretty good cleanse for the dwarf. So this is actually going to be pretty awesome. What's especially good about this, if you're playing a dwarf rogue, is the rogues vanish back in Classic. If you got any damage after you vanish, you were going to pop out of stealth. So using stone form in conjunction with vanish is going to be huge for rogues. And the last racial that dwarves have is gun specialization, which just increases your gun skill by 5. It's not something that we really need to worry about. It's going to be useful for hunters, but like the mace and sword specializations with the humans, it shouldn't really be something that you go out of your way to get. Next race we're going to talk about for the Alliance is the Gnomes. The Gnomes' first racial is Escape Artist. Escape Artist lets you escape the effects of any immobilization or movement speed reduction effects. It has a 1-second cast time, and it has a 1-minute cooldown. That 1-minute cooldown is actually pretty useful. It's pretty short when you compare it to all of the other racials that have some sort of cooldown. This is going to be better on melee classes, but it's definitely not wasted on a caster. There's going to be situations where you're going to need it for both casters and melee, although you may find that situation coming up more often if you're playing melee. Next up for the Gnomes is Expansive Mind. Expansive Mind increases your intellect by 5%. This is going to be huge for casters. That 5% in is going to be pretty big, especially once you get to later in the game and you're worrying about PvP at level 60. So this is definitely a thumbs up if you're playing a caster. Next up, we got Arcane Resistance, and Arcane Resistance is just going to increase your Arcane Resistance by 10. It's not something that you should go out of your way to look for. It's not going to be that useful in most situations. You will have an advantage when you go up against some hunters and when you go up against arcane mages, but it's not something that you should really worry about going out of your way to look at. The last racial that we got to worry about for the Gnome is Engineering Specialist, which increases your engineering by 15. Now, there are some items that you can make with an engineer to use in PvP that will actually be pretty useful, and you could actually turn the tides of a fight because of it. So I'm going to actually say that this is a pretty useful skill for PvP on the side that you actually pick up engineering and you don't, go enchanting and tailoring. And the last race we got to talk about for the Alliance is the Night Elf. The Night Elf's first racial is Shadow Meld. Shadow Meld lets you slip into the shadows, reducing the chance that enemies will detect your presence. This lasts until you cancel it or until you move. Night Elf rogues and druids with Shadow Meld are harder to detect while they're stealth or prowling. So Shadow Meld back in the day, you used to not be able to use it in combat like we can now. So it's not going to be a game changer when it comes to PvP. The time you're going to be seeing it used the most is right after a fight is done and somebody starts eating and then Shadow Melds, so that way they can't be seen while they're trying to get their health or their mana back up. So because of this, I really wouldn't put this on my radar as something that you need to have. Next up is Quickness, and Quickness is just a dodge chance that's increased by 1%. It's really not that great. It's not horrible, but when you compare it to Perception and Stoneform and Escape Artist, it's definitely not nearly as nice as some of the other racials that the Alliance have. Next up for the Night Elf, we got Wisp Spirit. Wisp Spirit is going to let you become a wisp when you die, and it just increases your movement speed by 50%. Now, this is useful when you're dead, but if you're in a battleground, you're just rezzing red at the graveyard anyways, so this is pretty much useless. So I really wouldn't worry too much about this one either. And lastly for the Night Elves is Nature Resistance, which just increases your nature resistance by 10. This is really not going to be that helpful. It is useful against druids and hunters and shaman, but I mean, other than that, I really wouldn't worry too much about this one either. So with all the Alliance done, let's move on to the Horde. First up, we got the Orc. The Orc's first racial is Blood Fury. Blood Fury increases base melee attack power by 25% for 15 seconds and reduces healing effects on you by 50% for 25 seconds, and it has a 2-minute cooldown. This is awesome for burst damage. It's great for trying to kill the flag carrier or try to kill that one last guy that's preventing you from capping a flag in AB. That being said, you can also die pretty easily with this because of the reduced healing you take. 50% is pretty huge back in Classic, so I wouldn't say that this is the best, but it's definitely really good if it's used in the right situations. The Orc's next racial is Hardiness, and Hardiness is a chance to resist stun effects increased by an additional 25%. This is really, really strong. A 25% chance is every 4 stuns that rogue is trying to hit you with, you're just going to resist because you're an Orc. That's fantastic. There's no reason why you wouldn't want to consider this when you're picking a race for PvP. Next is Command. Command is just going to increase the damage you deal with Hunter and Warlock pets by 5%. Like it says, it's only going to be useful for Hunters and Warlocks. It might be something you want to consider, but personally, I feel like there are other places that you should be looking if the Warlock and the Hunter are what you're trying to decide between. And the last racial for the Orc is Axe Specialization. Axe Specialization just increases your skill with axes and two-handed axes by 5. Again, this is going to be good for the situational class and build, so I wouldn't say that this is something you should be going out of your way to look at, but if you do plan on playing a warrior, because of this, the Orc looks pretty solid if you ask me. So the next race we got to talk about is the Troll. The Troll's first racial is Berserking. Berserking increases casting and attack speed by 10 to 25%. At full health, the speed is 10% with a greater effect up to 25 if you are badly hurt when activating Berserking. This lasts for 10 seconds and has a 3-minute cooldown. So this is pretty much just a baby Bloodlust if you ask me. It is pretty useful. It's going to be a nice another burst for your DPS when you're trying to burst down that flag carrier or cap something in AB. So it is definitely pretty good, but when you compare it to others, how good is it really? I'd say it might actually be better than most of the Alliance ones, but I don't think it touches Hardiness. Next troll racial is Regeneration. Regeneration lets your health regeneration rate increase by 10%, and 10% of total health regeneration may continue during combat. In PvP, this could be very, very useful. Now, I don't think that this is something that you should really be worrying about, however. I mean, there's other combination of racials that are more important, but it's definitely not something to just, not look at and consider when you're picking a class. Next up is Beast Slaying. Beast Slaying just increases your damage dealt to beasts by 5%. This is useless for PvP. We're only fighting humanoids, so let's just go straight to the next one. Throwing and Bow Specialization. This will increase your skill with throwing and bow weapons by 5. This is only going to be good for hunters. I know that warriors can use throwing weapons and bows, but let's be honest here, this is only good for hunters. Next up for the Horde are the Undead. The Undead's first racial is Will of the Forsaken. This provides immunity to charm, fear, and sleep while active. It may also be used while already afflicted by charm, fear, or sleep. It lasts for 5 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown. When it comes to PvP, this is my favorite racial out of all the races from Classic. It is a legitimate free second trinket. A lot of people don't remember, but the trinkets back in Classic weren't like the Gladiator's medallion that we have today. The trinkets only removed specific types of immunities. Some of them were fear, some of them were charms, and some of them had combinations of different things, but using this in combination with your other trinket is going to be huge, and it's going to be a game changer for anybody who chooses Undead. Next is Cannibalize. When you activate Cannibalize, you regenerate 7% of your total health every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. Only works on humanoid and undead corpses within 5 yards. Any movement, action, or damage while cannibalizing will cancel the effect. This is just a free food, and it actually regenerates your health pretty quick, so it's nice to have. It's going to be useful in 1v1 situations or when you're the last man standing, kind of similar how you can use Shadow Meld combined with eating. Next is Underwater Breathing. Underwater breath lasts 300% longer than normal. Completely useless, moving on. Shadow Resistance. Shadow Resistance increased by 10, just like every other resistance. It's only 10. Not something you should go out of your way to get, though. Something to think about, but not something to go out of your way to get. And lastly, for the Horde, we have the Tauren. The Tauren's first racial is War Stomp. War Stomp stuns up to 5 enemies within 8 yards for 2 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown. This actually isn't that bad. It could definitely be better, but considering how awesome the other racials are for the Horde, that this one is a little bit lackluster is understanding. But it is a free AoE interrupt essentially, so definitely something that's useful in certain situations. Next we have Endurance, which just increases your total health by 5%. It's probably better for PvE when you're trying to find a main tank, but having extra life in PvP isn't a bad idea, so it's definitely going to get the, yeah, this is good, but it's definitely not one of the better ones to get. Next we have Cultivation, which just increases your herbalism skill by 15. Again, this kind of stuff in PvP is completely useless. Moving on. And lastly, we have Nature Resistance, and this is exactly like the Night Elves one. It just increases your resistance by 10, so not something that you really need to go out of your way to look at. So now, we've gone over all the racials, so the question still remains. What class is best with which race? So, to do that, we're going to have to go down the Horde and the Alliance, because obviously these aren't even, and I don't even think it's even close. I think the Horde's racials are way better. But anyways, let's talk about who's best for the Alliance and the Horde for each class. First up, the Druid, easy one. The Night Elf is the only class that can be the Druid for the Alliance, and the Tauren is the only one for the Horde. So the Night Elf and the Tauren are your obvious winners for the Druid. Moving on to the Hunter. For the Alliance, the only option really should be is the Dwarf. The only other race that can be a Hunter is the Night Elf, and the Night Elf, quite honestly, is not that good for PvP. When it comes to the Horde, it's got to be the Orc. The Tauren and the Troll can also be Hunters, but that Blood Fury and that Hardiness, the Hardiness is what really makes it great for the Orc. So, because of Hardiness, the Orc is going to take it for the Hunter. Next is the Mage. For the Alliance, it's definitely going to be the Gnome. I mean, you got Escape Artist and Expansive Mind and Engineering Specialist. All three of those things are great for a Mage. So it's definitely going to be the Gnome for the Alliance. And for the Horde, it's pretty easy choice as well. This is going to be the Undead. Pretty much, if the Undead can play it, it's probably going to be them. Maybe you might want to choose Orc, but the Mage can only be a Troll or an Undead, and Undead has way better racials, in my opinion, than the Troll. Next is the Priest. The Priest is special because the Priest has special racials for each race. And because of that, on the Alliance, I'm going to have to say the Dwarf because of Fear Ward. Fear Ward is going to be awesome, especially when you're going up against, you know, the Warlocks and the Warriors. So Dwarf gets the nod for the Alliance. For the Horde, I'm going with Undead again. The Undead are just too strong when it comes to PvP because of that Will of the Forsaken. It's just so good to have that free second trinket. Next is the Paladin. The Paladin, it's got to be the Dwarf. I mean, you still get Stone Form. The only other race that can be the Paladin is the Human, and the Human, just quite honestly, their abilities aren't that great for PvP. So Dwarf's getting the nod for Paladin. Next class is the Rogue. And unfortunately, I hate seeing Dwarf Rogues, but I'm going to have to give them the nod here because of Stone Form and Vanish. I mean, you can use Escape Artist and try and sprint away, but it's not nearly as good as Stone Form with Vanish. For the Horde, it's going to be between the Orc and the Undead. Hardiness and Will of the Forsaken are two extremely strong racials. It really comes down to a matter of what you prefer to have. I personally think the Undead takes the slight edge to the Orc, but that's just my personal opinion, so for the sake of this video, the Undead get the nod for the Rogue. Next up is the Shaman, and the Shaman is definitely going to go to the Orc. Their hardiness is just way better than Regeneration or War Stomp between the Tauren and the Troll, so obviously the Orc is going to get the nod for the Shaman. And next up is the Warrior. Now for the Alliance, this one's kind of tough. You could either go with the Dwarf for Stone Form or the Gnome for Escape Artist. Those are going to definitely be your two best options. If you do go with Gnome though, you got to realize that Expansive Mind, which is a great racial, is completely wasted. That being said, Escape Artist is so strong on a melee class that you can make the argument that Gnome is the proper choice here. Personally, if I had to choose between the two, I'd probably take the Dwarf for Stone Form. I do really like the Escape Artist, but that extra defensive with Stone Form and the cleanse of all those bleed, poison, and disease effects, I think that's what really pushes us over the edge for Dwarf for me, but Gnome is a very, very close second. And for the Horde, there's no doubt about it. I mentioned it earlier. The Orc Warrior is going to be your go-to choice. Hardiness, again, is going to be your go-to reason for why you want to choose the Orc. So you get hardiness, you get Blood Fury, and you get that axe specialization. So it's really a good choice when you choose the Warrior and Orc together. And lastly, we have the Warlock. The Warlock for the Alliance is going to go to the Gnome because of that Expansive Mind and the Escape Artist and the Engineering Specialist. All three of those are going to be great for a Warlock when it comes to PvP. And when it comes to the Horde, it's really tough. You got to choose between the Undead and the Orc again. Both are really strong. It comes down to a matter of opinion. I'd have to say, though, I'd give a slight edge to the Orc just because Command is actually useful here. Where you get that extra 5% damage from your pets with the Warlock. But having Cannibalize with Will of the Forsaken, Cannibalize is going to be great on the Warlock because of the life tapping. So I would definitely say that Undead is not out of the ballpark for the Warlock. But I will give the edge to the Orc with a very close second for the Undead. And that's it, guys. That's all of the classes, all of the racials, all of the races. If you guys think that I was off the rocker about some of these choices, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to know what you guys think. I personally think this is a pretty good list. Essentially what it boils down to is, can you play Dwarf or Gnome on the Alliance, or are you going to play Orc or Undead on the Horde? If you're looking at racials and what's going to be the strongest racials for you. Anyways, guys, that's all I got for this one. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey, it's Ratted here. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel. We put out multiple new videos each week, and we appreciate all of your support. Thanks for watching, everyone, and cheers.